Welcome to another episode of the Being and Doing podcast. And today I am very happy and curious to talk to Peter Philippson. And the reason I have reached out to him is it has started with my personal journey in Gestalt therapy. And I was kind of in love with the concept, almost infatuated to some extent. And I was frantically looking to the resources that are available around Gestalt in the UK. And then I have accidentally came to the Manchester Gestalt Center page, and I saw that Peter has a plethora of very interesting titles and lectures. And before that, I was very naive. I didn't really know about your work and even about your position in the Gestalt community. But interestingly, I watched one of these videos and there was this pervasive feeling of calmness on one hand and incredible creativity on the other. And somehow that creativity is really what kind of pulled me in incredibly into really wanting to kind of almost like drink from that source. And basically that's the reason we're having this contact and this conversation today. So really thank you for taking your time. And I'm very curious myself where all of this is going to lead. So my first question is basically, what are the words that you yourself identify with? Either adjectives or nouns or verbs, whatever you feel like you are close to, kind of.
I think at this stage, there are lots of different words. Interested is one. Try and stay interested in lots of different things. Mm-hmm. Flexible, able to sort of try my hand at different things. I could say more about that, but maybe just go with the adjectives at the moment. Sociable, Gestaltist, family man, neighbor, musician, Aikidoist, aging. Two of those get in the way of each other.
Yes.
Humorous.
And do you mind me like looking in your eyes? There is also one thing that is very dominant for me is aware, is that there is this clarity that I see. I don't know if you would identify yourself with that, but that's what also I can observe.
Yes, I can be very clear, but also I enjoy time just sitting in front of television watching Death in Paradise or something, and very different. So I don't want to be doing that all the time.
And actually, when you said flexible, that somehow stayed in my mind. And what is it, the mental gymnastics that you are doing to maintain that flexibility? Sometimes I kind of relate the body and the mind, and actually, like on the body, some people, in order to stay flexible, they actually need to put in a lot of work. And so is that an innate quality you have, or?
an early learned quality. My family were refugees. I had to, in the 30s, leave Austria and Germany to survive, make a living and a life in a different country with no money at first, with a different language, and also with a knowledge that a stable life can suddenly be uprooted. And they were survivors, and I was taught about that by their example, by how they were. And I've also done a number of different things in my life. I've studied philosophy. I've been a singer. I've been a youth and community worker. My life hasn't been linear, and now with the pandemic, I think I deal with it easier than some people because, again, okay, the world's changed, and my early learning comes up there.
Yeah, I can relate maybe to some extent as someone from the Balkans, because we kind of live in a constant state of change, and there has been as well wars and kind of constant need to adapt in a way. So it's almost like a survival mechanism to some extent.
Well, it is, yes.
Yeah. And actually, I was almost tempted to ask you, what do you like to sing most? And when was the last time you actually sang?
Well, before the pandemic, I was in a big choir in Manchester, and the last thing we sang was a modern piece. I can't even remember the name of it. My memory isn't as good as it used to be. But we've sung Brahms' Requiem and all sorts of different things.
Wow, that's so. What does that? Because I love singing as well, also Serbian traditional music, and I'm just wondering, what does that do to you? That moment when you are kind of in this space of resonance with the voice and with other people, kind of.
I love it. It's a kind of sharing which is tremendous, to be singing with 200 people, and the most beautiful form of confluence in Gestalt terms. I've been doing it for so many years. It's a big part of me. I recently discovered a video of me singing when I was actually a singer in 1969, singing Verdi Requiem with Leonard Bernstein conducting. You know,
wow.
And I found that on YouTube. There's a close-up of me, age 18.
And you were not aware that this video exists?
Well, I knew it was filmed, but I didn't know it was on YouTube.
Oh, wow. Wow. I can't even imagine having that span of years to look back at. So it is really an interesting concept. So I'm curious. So do you mind if I ask how old are you?
Please just ask anything.
Okay, so
if I don't want to answer, I'll answer. But
great.
that doesn't mean you shouldn't have asked.
Great.
Yeah, I'm 68.
So basically, you lived. You said in the 30s your family moved. So you were born then
In Britain.
Okay.
My father was German, my mother Austrian, and they met in Britain. And I've always lived in Britain, but my first language was German.
And I'm just then wondering, so basically you didn't directly experience the war.
No, I was born in 52.
It's but then it's because when you said it, it felt like it was your direct experience for some reason. At least that's how it kind of impacted me. Right. And then I'm just thinking,
my direct experience was parents who had to find and make a life for themselves. And it was very difficult, and sometimes difficult for me because my parents were obviously German speaking, and this was shortly after a war against Germany. Yeah. So that got me bullied in school. And so, those were the direct experiences.
And how in one way this shapes us, as you said, in terms of the flexibility, but what were those moments of pain or trauma that kind of you feel you had to eventually work through with a more conscious mind, let's say?
Yeah, well, generally being an outsider, it wasn't just the sort of different background that I had, and the way I was seen by other kids and teachers to some extent as well. But also, my family had to move around a lot. My father was a communist, and he got blacklisted and couldn't get jobs, and so we then moved. So it was difficult for me to settle and make roots. So it's no coincidence that I've actually been living in one city, in Manchester, since 1970. I want to have roots.
Yeah, and there are many things that are coming, so I will take a second to actually focus on one. I'm curious, as someone who is kind of bathed in the communist regime myself, I always had this struggle between the individual and the collective, very much ingrained in me. And only after I left Serbia, actually, I was starting to be aware of the collective unconscious and of me normalizing everyone and how that impacted me. Yeah. And I'm just curious, basically, what was your process into understanding the individual versus the collectivistic kind of way of thinking, and how did that look like for you in a way?
I don't think it was ever quite as simple as that for me, because at one level, my father believed in collective things, and also had tremendous support from communist groupings when he came to Britain. They were people who supported him. But at the same time, our family were quite individual because we were very different from a lot of those around. So I've always been left wing and involved in left wing politics. Um, but I'm not a communist. And at one stage, I was much more a Paul Goodman anarchist. Um, but I think in my thinking about self, it, all this has sort of come in because I'm trying to hold together the idea of um, self-emergent from the situation, but also of being an individual and able to be creative and different. So how to hold those two together has been really important for me in all sorts of different ways.
And do you mind elaborating that a little bit? Like, what does it mean for you to hold together the emergent self, the one that is created in contact, and the creativity in that contact, in a way?
Yeah. I think that's for me, the defining thing of a human being, that human beings are very socially um, um, connected, and with a very strong intersubjective element. And at the same time, human beings have the ability at any moment to say no to the collectivity, and say, and I'm going to do this. And Gestalt therapy seems to have swung between those two poles, between being individualist and anti-individualist. And both of those lose the what for me is central, which is how we have to find a place to set our camp within those two poles. You could say it's a dialectic. And that is the complicated thing. And that's what the existentialists were talking about. So I'm very much influenced by existentialism and Sartre people, because they're talking about that.
Yeah, I'm curious. So that's basically, there's this sentence that always comes to mind: some things in life are not problems to solve, they are paradoxes to manage. And this one sounds as one of those, where we're constantly managing that paradox while interacting with the environment.
Well, the managing of that paradox is life.
Yes, exactly.
Human life.
Exactly.
It's and life leads to problems to be solved, but it is the solving of those in line with those two natures that is the stuff of living. How do I engage with people? Do I fit in? Do I try and change things? Fritz Perls had this idea, which again is getting unpopular now, of aggression.
Oh, I read that recently, actually. Yes.
But that's speaking to the same thing, that human beings don't just find a hole in the ground and inhabit it. We design and build houses, to do that, we knock down mountains to get the materials for that. We are never, as Heidegger said, thrown into the world. As we come into the world, the way we come into it changes the world we find. I say that even babies are never thrown into the world. When a baby's born, it isn't thrown into an objective world. It's born into a world in which a baby has just been born.
Yeah.
Which is very special, a very particular kind of world.
Yes.
So Malcolm Parlett uses the term tailoring. We tailor the world as we enter it. And that is, I think, a vitally important part of how we engage.
Yeah, I'm almost imagining this kind of Einstein showing a ball in a gravity, and like as if all of us is bending the space and time in a certain way, and by moving we are constantly doing that.
That's right, yes. And we also can generate our own gravity.
Yeah.
So we have our own gravity and pull the world towards us.
Exactly. And in terms of objective and reality, I also I recently read one of your articles, but then it's Zen and the Art of Pinball. But then I love the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Yeah, me too.
And as a scientist, actually, I was and still am obsessed with the truth. And well, objectivity, if you want. And I actually really had this pertinent question for you in my mind. What does truth or objectivity mean for you? And actually, in the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, there is this moment where he explains we are trying to cut the knife with the knife. And so basically, how close can we get to understanding ourselves in that truthful manner, let's say? So yeah, you can take this wherever you want.
Oh, wow. Now we're getting to another interest of mine, Husserl. And I like what he said, that the problem is that when we talk about objective truth, we are acting as if we are observers from outside the world looking at the world. And so it's not so much about objective truth, but that we're objectifying ourselves rather than being a subjectivity. And in fact, science hasn't been doing that since Einstein over a century ago. That isn't the scientific paradigm now. It hasn't been for a century, but human beings non-scientists haven't caught up with that. We are part of what we observe. So there's a prior question that Husserl talked about, which is, what is it about this whole field, if you like, including our consciousness, that our consciousness produces a coherent world with things that are truths, which we can share with others even. So I can see an apple, eat an apple, give the apple, the other can eat the apple. So it's clear that we aren't living in worlds of just separate phenomenologies,
Mm-hmm.
but that we are part of the field in which this happens, so that there's that coherence.
And in that terms, I'm sometimes always interested in how we I will take a moment to make it clear for myself. How we, let's say, agree on a certain level of truth, and are able to break it when new information comes. So basically, as a scientist, I feel like we are building the knowledge of the world we live in as a collective, and internally as an individual. And so basically, maybe my question would be, how do you think progress happens in the human race? Because somehow there is a feeling of progress, whether it's objective or subjective, it's unclear. But I'm just curious to see to ask you basically, what do you see as progress, and what is that part of us as human beings that makes it happen?
I like the description that Thomas Kuhn gave. And he was the subject of my postgraduate thesis. That we don't work to progress, but to explore within what we know. And paradoxically, it's precisely in doing deeper and deeper explorations of what we know that we suddenly, if you like, fall off the end of our world. And discover, this doesn't fit. And even there, because everything we do is based on a certain way of looking at the world. Normal science called it, that we then try and check whether we've made a mistake in our calculations, or whether there's a simple fix to make it fit in. And it's only when those don't work that we say, right, we need to look elsewhere.
Yes. And sorry, did you want to add something?
And that fits very much with therapy, because people's lives when they come to therapy are working in various ways, but they're not just going to walk out of their house because they have nowhere nourishing to go to. So they try and fix it, they try and do various things. And it is only at a stage where they think, no, there is something essentially not right here, that then a new way of looking at the world can happen, and people can do quite radical things to change their lives.
And this is actually a good interlude for me to talk about therapy. And the first question I would like to ask you is about Gestalt. For people who have never encountered it, what would you say Gestalt is? And interestingly, I stimulated by you, I'm reading the book Gestalt Is, with the small Gestalt. So I'm very curious. What are you thinking about this?
Okay.
Feeling.
I need to say a back thing, which is that Gestalt therapy has been around since the late 1940s. And like any therapy that's been around for a long time, there are a number of different answers that you could get. So you'll kind of get my answer, which is nearer to what was being talked about in the 1940s and 1950s than some of what's being talked about now. And there's a number of us now who are going back to the early ideas and the early writings. So Gestalt therapy grew out of essentially psychoanalysis. The main founder, Fritz Perls, was a psychoanalyst, and he um, moved in a more and more radical direction away from the psychoanalytic community. But what he did was he operationalized all the analytic ideas as field relational ideas, very much influenced by Buber and also by Gestalt psychology, and by the small amount that he knew about Zen Buddhism and Eastern thought. So what it says in its original formulation is that therapy isn't an intrapsychic thing. The problems that we deal with were developed in relationships, are sustained in recreating those kind of relationships, and show themselves in therapy in the relationship with the therapist, in what contact is made and what contact is not made, in what people allow themselves to become aware of or block awareness of. And to some extent, we all do that to make this coherent world I spoke about. But then that coherent world is becomes a problem because it was built up at a particular time in the childhood family often. And it just doesn't work now.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, especially if creativity was not supported in the family or was dangerous, then they will be frightened to move to questioning or creating what would happen if I tried something different.
Mm-hmm.
So the therapy is not cognitive in terms of working new things out, because that's essentially conservative. It's always within what we know. It's normal science in Kuhn's terms. It is about experimenting in the relationship with the therapist and in things that we try together to check those limits and to see what else is there. And that is where people reorient to new possibilities. So there's a famous Gestalt psychology picture where you have something which you can see as a vase or as two faces.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is we flick between the two, depending on what we make foreground and what we make background. And that kind of reorganization of awareness and experience is the change mode. So the startling thing about that is that it is essentially instantaneous.
Mm-hmm.
You can't see the vase and the faces at the same time. You can only instantaneously flick between them. So what takes the time in therapy is building up the support and the information experiences which allow for that. But the change when it comes is where the client says, I found myself doing this, but I don't do that. So that's a kind of quick explanation of how I would understand Gestalt therapy.
And I always had this feeling that therapy works for me.
Mm-hmm.
And because I enjoy, and almost I enjoy the process of constantly questioning myself. As a scientist, also constantly proving myself wrong, or
Mm-hmm.
eventually starting to believe. But then kind of coming from Serbia, where this is not still, where mental health in itself is also still not talked about openly, and where there is a fear of going to therapy because you're crazy, and a lot of these kind of questions. I'm wondering, how would you explain, or how would you kind of soothe people into saying it is okay to go through this process? Because for me, it's really enriching, but then I'm constantly kind of faced with the stigma around everything.
Well, I think cultures change as well.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things Paul Goodman, who was one of the co-founders of Gestalt therapy, said is that there's a certain kind of sanity which is really neurotic, and a lot of symptoms would disappear with social change. But you would get going to therapy would be an act of defiance in itself, which actually in some ways would make the therapy easier, because the people that you're getting, even if you get fewer people, would be very motivated and willing to take risks, because coming to therapy in itself is a risk. But, in a very practical way, Manchester, when I started being a Gestalt therapist there in the late 80s, didn't have a therapy scene. It's a post-industrial city with a kind of working class culture. And I went around and talked to groups, to social groups and church groups and Rotary clubs, and all sorts of people, and talked about what we did. And what I found is that slowly things developed. People told other people, and I wasn't the only one doing this. Other people were also doing this, and so it's much more normal that people go to therapy or to counseling.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that it's been supported by that. There's been more about that in films and on television. So it's part of the cultural discourse now, much more than it was.
And I'm also curious, because I had a lot of resistance from people being like, some things are not proven scientifically. And let's say Gestalt therapy is still not what would people call evidence-based. And I played with different kinds of therapy myself. And it's just that I have this subjective feeling that it is something extremely rich and useful for me and then potentially for others. And then I'm basically curious. It's a really funny metaphor I have for myself. It's almost like as a scientist, homeopathy for me, for example, is something I am almost deeply against, because it might work as a placebo, but I don't see any kind of scientific validity in it. Mm-hmm. But then when it comes to therapy, I sometimes feel that we cannot use science to show the importance and the validity of it. So and then I'm kind of almost unable to hold these two poles myself. So I'm then curious. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think the situation is much better than that. Mm-hmm. And also in some ways much worse. The worst thing is that many therapies, and in a way Gestalt therapy in some places more than others, is seen as almost a kind of spiritual discipline with unquestionable things, and of course it works because this is what my teacher told me. Mm-hmm. And there is the same placebo thing. There are some people who have never had somebody just consistently listen to them.
Yes, exactly.
And that will help a hell of a lot of people, whatever you do, even if it's your taxi driver. So of course you can point to people who are better. But I think that there is a need for research in Gestalt therapy, and that is growing. Mm-hmm. And I've contributed to some of the literature on that. Mm-hmm. And it needs to be done by people who are not Gestalt therapists.
Exactly.
But at the same time, it doesn't lend itself to manualized random controlled trials, mm-hmm. because that just doesn't fit with the theory and practice. And there have been some attempts to take something like empty chair and see, how many people got better. But how much physics or chemistry is done in the Large Hadron Collider? We'll do this, see what happens. It's not solution focused. In fact, it's hoping that the solutions that we're expecting don't happen. Mm-hmm. So it is a very limited view of science and would actually block creative science.
Yes.
If that was held. But the other side of that is that some Gestalt people are really seeing research as just a new kind of advertising. Well, everybody else does it, so we'd better do it. And it's not about questioning. So, for example, there's this thing, the paradoxical theory of change, yes, that says that we change best if the therapist is not a change agent. If you start with what is and then see where you go from a real acceptance of what is, which I like, but it's a statement. And if you have a statement saying this works best, it really does require that you check it. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't seem right to me.
Mm-hmm.
It seems mostly right, but there are situations in which it's absolutely wrong.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if somebody is not in a certain amount of sensory contact with their world, they can't self-regulate in the way that the paradoxical theory implies. So somebody who's paranoid is self-regulating perfectly well to a world in which everybody's out to get them and where they are the center of everything. It just isn't the actual world, and the paradoxical theory doesn't work. The therapist needs to be a change agent and to orient people towards sensory connection with the world, touching, looking, listening, tasting. And once they can do that, then the paradoxical theory works. And there are other examples like that.
Yeah, I mean that's
But
actually. I'm sorry. That comes to something that I listened to. So basically, when we think about working with people in a therapy setting, depending on the context, there are certain almost like hierarchies we need to address, and there are things we need to address first, so that we can apply then another thing. So sometimes if someone has, let's say, a disordered attachment, and then another layer of, if one would say, co-occurrence of another problem, then we would need to address, let's say, the attachment first and then something else. So it's kind of a layered process, and basically always a non-linear one, I guess.
Well, absolutely. And if somebody has a very disordered attachment, then they will show that in the relationship with us as we try and help them with the other things. They won't trust us, for example. Absolutely, yes. I want to say something else about research, which is that there is one research which is very strongly supporting Gestalt therapy. And my proposal has always been that we focus on that. That's the latest research in neuroscience, in developmental theory, very strongly supports what Gestalt therapy has been saying for 50, 60 years. So in the Louis Cosolino's book, The Neuroscience of Psychotherapy, he says Gestalt therapy is uniquely geared towards this kind of neurological change. Daniel Stern is another example of somebody who, through his researches, has come from a position where his theoretical view was based on psychoanalysis to now, to before his death, collaborating with Gestalt people. And what he writes is basically a kind of rediscovery of Gestalt therapy. I think that the mechanisms of change that are being discovered in how we change as we develop from childhood onwards, and the neurological aspects, Alan Shaw, and people like that, very strongly supports what Gestalt therapy has been saying.
And I have one more question around that, but then there are other things I want to touch on. It's this thing that sometimes we have the feeling as therapists, I'm not one, but someone, that how much do we actually, let's say, speed up the process? Because I feel like, or change the process, because sometimes I'm thinking even about child rearing. Sometimes we feel like we have influence on their change and on their development. but sometimes that development is actually just the natural process, and we kind of almost like correlate it with our action, but it's a correlation without direct causation. So I'm curious, basically, what do you think about the number of times where the change happened in correlation without causation with you, and the number of times where you felt the change was really coming from what you have directly kind of influenced?
Right. Well, your title is Being and Doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what changes things is at the level of being, not at the level of doing.
Mm-hmm.
So, thinking about myself also as a parent, that yes, there would have been things that we did which influenced the children and things like that. But the main thing that influences how children engage with the world is their being together with the people who they are together with for their childhood. And that is inseparable from the being of the parents and the siblings. Again, it's the stuff that can't be random control trials. It's just the way we look at each other, the way we hold each other, the way we conflict with each other, because conflict is a major part of parenting in childhood, and I think also part of therapy, especially if they have bad experiences of conflict in childhood. That's, I think, what affects, but not in a linear causal way.
Yeah. I mean, I had that experience where sometimes there are changes which are impossible to express in words, and also things which are impossible to measure and express with words. So I was in a yoga teacher training for 20 days immersed in kind of a very sensory experience, and as you would say, being kind of experience.
Yes.
And by the end of that time, I really felt like we have all been different, and I haven't communicated much with any one of my colleagues and students and friends. And this is something that I feel maybe it's our culture today that kind of has imposed these metrics in order for something to be justified. And also, almost as you said, it's an advertisement. We need to put a stamp, scientifically proven, although some things actually do work at this very, very sensory level.
Yes. But science has actually not had that paradigm since the early 20th century. That's the joke. It isn't real science. It's what people call science.
Yes, exactly. And I would like to come to the creativity process, and to the place where you actually make your, let's say, the place where you have your impact on the client as well, which really strikes me. And I always had this thought, regardless, even when I was not in therapy, I always had this feeling, my life philosophy impacts all my actions. So constantly, what do I believe as that value is will impact my actions. And you being a philosophy, or somehow formed by philosophy, is very interesting for me. And so I'm just wondering, basically, how do you question yourself And then also, how do you, what's the place that you make the interventions with your clients, kind of?
Mostly, my interventions just come now. I am also quite critical and thinking about how I'm working, and take it to supervision and readjust. But that's afterwards or before. In the process, if I do that, then what I'm also doing is taking myself out of the contact. So all that knowledge or experience has to become background that hopefully supports the contact which is happening right now. And I want to both stay with the client, and I also want to stay with my potential for creativity, and to go with what seems like the next step in our dance together. And I don't want it to be just the familiar dance for either of us, so that we can find new dances together. And it's how to do that it is for me the important thing.
So that's that thing with the dance and not doing the familiar dance is something that I'm curious about. So that takes a lot of energy, actually, to put yourself almost out of your comfort zone very often. And I'm curious. Did you have moments of like, oh, I'm tired of changing, of constantly changing? I need to take a pause, and then I will take it to supervision. But now it's just overwhelming.
Well, yes, I do. I mean, that's where Death in Paradise comes in. But I love being able to do that. So it's not just in therapy. I love jazz, and improvising on the piano. Or I like cooking, and I like inventing new recipes.
So it's for you almost a lifestyle.
It's a lifestyle. Well, it's part of my lifestyle. The other part is to just enjoy sitting with the people I like or love, and just chatting together, and not being particularly creative at all. But I want to have both of those available.
Yeah. And actually, I was reading one of the articles as well, and there was one thing I related to, is that as therapists, I would say we, and I don't know why, but live in this culture of we always need to have deep conversations. It's almost like a subculture, like unconscious. And then when you need to relate to a client in a more cheerful, kind of bubbly way, sometimes it's not accessible to us. And I'm curious, was that something that you became aware at some point, or you kind of were having these both kind of tools, let's say, available for you?
I have both really available, and they support each other. I absolutely think that therapy needs to go to the darkest, most painful, most difficult places, because those are the things that bring people. But I can do that best because I don't spend all my time in the dark. I'm a very sort of cheerful person most of the time. And our family has a tremendous sense of humor. My daughter sent me a text message with a crazy pun that she'd come across, yes, or invented possibly yesterday, and it's just part of what our culture.
Yes. Yeah, that's actually that's kind of a creativity spring as well, I would say. Yeah. I somehow am kind of thinking, oh, the podcast is exploring success and I haven't asked the question, but somehow there are so many beautiful things to explore with you. So I would just ask maybe, what is the first time you were aware of the word success, of the concept? And then was there any moment that you felt successful?
I felt periods of success and periods of failure. Um, I got thrown out of university in my master's program for my political activities, and then had to do something else. So, and I wouldn't have been a Gestalt therapist if that hadn't happened. So, uh, uh, I don't think success is something that I've ever wanted to make as an aim. It's more other people have seen me as a success. I've shown what I have. And the other important thing is that my trainer was very into being the biggest and the best and most successful, and it ended in tragedy, and it was really awful. And I absolutely don't want to go down that route. So I want to be who I am. I want it to work. I want to be a success in that way. If I do therapy, I want it to be good therapy. If I play music, I want it to be good music. If I cook food, I want it to be good food. But that's more important for me. And yes, I like people appreciating me. And at the same time, I'm aware of the shadow of that. I remember a Gestalt conference, and there was somebody who'd just come into a Gestalt program and didn't know anybody. And we were chatting. We found all sorts of things that we both liked in common, and we were having a great discussion. And you could see it slowly dawning on her who I was with capital letters, and the contacts shattered, and it was a loss. There's this wonderful organization development principle, the SNAFU principle. SNAFU, American Army term, situation normal, all fucked up. And the SNAFU principle says that true communication is only possible between equals.
Yes.
Therefore, the higher up somebody becomes in the hierarchy, the less they know what's going on.
Yes.
So I'm very aware of that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, that's the beauty of Gestalt. I always felt I was always somehow authority averse, and I always want, basically I have this insatiable need for contact, And
Mhm.
when you feel that you can have contact with the child, and then again with someone who has such a tremendous life experience, of course there is respect, but you don't want that to ruin the contact.
Yeah,
And that's basically, yeah, I guess what you're describing. Yeah.
yeah, yes, yeah.
I mean, I have
I
to.
mean,
Sorry.
people talk a bit, about, well, I want to write an article or speak at a conference, but I'm scared of doing that. But you do it so easily, and I say, well, I was that, and everybody starts with that, and then you just do it, and eventually it becomes easier.
Yes, yes. Yeah, exactly. And I'm curious, um, there's one question which always comes to me, because it's also like a um, um, let's say something that bears change. Is what is a truth about reality that you were kind of unwilling to accept for the longest time, that kind of impeded you to develop uh, a certain growth edge?
Um, the uh, right, it's being an outsider.
Mm.
Um, that it was clear to me in much of my early life that I was an outsider,
Mhm.
and that helped in that I had no um, roots that hadn't been uprooted. Um, and what mostly helped me with that was not therapy, but coming to Manchester.
Mm.
And I really strongly feel like I belong here because it's very diverse, very contactful. Um, Everybody talks to everybody else, which has made it very difficult to do the pandemic stuff.
Mhm.
Um, uh, and uh, Lots of talking between and interaction between the two communities. So a few Christmases ago, they were doing the Arabian Nights at a theatre, and a group of us locally went along to see it. And about half the group were white, and about half the group were Muslims. And we saw it from a different cultural perspective. And then we went for a pizza to talk about it together. And that's the sort of thing that happens in Manchester. And there here, I really felt I belong. And I've, as I said, been here 50 years.
Wow. Yeah, it's somehow the, like, I still have for myself the longing and like the hope that there will be a moment where like I would just kind of place my roots somewhere. But
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah, you know that.
and I'm thinking, w- what are the people that you feel, and I would ask this question in a different way now, but the people that formed you, but that they are not necessarily um, any big names, but you know, those small interactions that you had, that you can recall, that made an impact on you, almost as if you read a big Fritz Perls book.
Oh, my parents, of
Mm.
course. Um, my brother. The teacher who took me to my first classical concert, even though I don't think his intentions were entirely honourable. It all worked out. The guy who told me when I wanted self-defense that I know you'll like Aikido and nothing else, and I've now been doing Aikido for 40 odd years. So more people than I can name. In a way, I think what therapy does at its best is it opens our capacity to meet people in ways that we can grow from, rather than that the growth happens in the therapy.
Mm, yes. And there are two questions here. One is Aikido and self-defense. So I recently had this, since I came to London, and again, when I read one of your articles, there was this thing, urban jungle, so where the jungle is, and I really felt it so strongly here. And I felt this strong need to go to a self-defense class.
Mm-hmm.
And also there was one thing that you said in one of the lectures that said some people become victims because they are not ready to be the monster. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, how did you get in touch with that part of yourself? It's either through Aikido, but also like how did you have been in touch with your aggressive part? There was a moment actually in one of your lectures where you actually were describing a situation in a supermarket when someone wanted to cut the line, and you actually kind of really had this matching emotion. And it's something that sometimes is very difficult for me. So I'm curious. I'm curious to hear more.
Well, it's inherent in my background. I was taught to treat people who were trying to do me down with contempt, not just to accept racism or prejudice. My uncle was killed in Germany as a resistance fighter. And that was part of the family culture. So that was there, and I can be aggressive if I need to be. I took up Aikido because I was working as a youth worker with homeless young people on the streets at night, and I felt the need to defend myself. And it's now that's not really the issue. I can do that if I need to, but it's just a wonderful thing to do together with people. But it also meant that if somebody else was being attacked, that I could do something with it. And I've done that a few times. So I value my capacity to be a monster. And it's also been important that I've valued, I've taught my kids also how to value that, while at the same time being able to be kind.
Yeah. Yes. And I'm also curious about how do you experience yourself in this moment in relations to where the world stands, and with all your experience, if you are to kind of leave something behind in let's say in let's say, I really wish the world would move in this direction, what would that direction be?
Well, right at the moment, I want the direction where we can meet and talk and hug each other again. More contact. I think more and more the world's dividing into camps who only talk to each other. I think the more we can meet and make whatever contact is possible, rather than just stay with the people who think the same as we do and things like that. But I don't know whether we'll manage it. I don't think human beings are a nice species.
Yes.
And I think there's plenty of evidence that, going back to aggression, that we are about the most aggressive species that the world has ever seen. And that aggression is also our creativity. So, I think human beings are ecologically bad by definition. We do blow up mountains to make houses and say, what would happen if we did this, I think the world would look better if that forest didn't exist, or if those people didn't exist, so I don't think any solutions can work which pretend that we are nicer than we are. So it's how we can contact in ways that allow for love and allow for conflict. And some people manage that, and some people don't manage that. So that's where the whole thing about contact becomes so important for me.
Yeah, somehow it feels like we are confined by the animal we are, and almost like, and that's okay.
Well, it is what is. It's not whether it's okay or not.
Yes.
And animals don't, in general, torture others of their species, and don't, in general, do wars of extermination. It's not the animal that's a problem. We have an imagination of a world we want, and we cut away what doesn't fit. And that's where we do the terrible things. Animals kill each other sometimes, mainly for food or for hierarchy or something, but that isn't the kind of cruelty that is terrible. And if you watch antelopes in a field with on a plain with a lion sleeping, they're fine, but they're very aware when the lion wakes up. But it isn't. There's nothing personal in all this.
Yeah. I mean, there's almost like kind of a bleakness and hope and love for the species we are, and they're all kind of, we need to hold all of them at the same time.
We need to hold what is.
Exactly.
Be human.
Exactly. Because it just feels sometimes that we are trying to also surpass the limits without really living what is and cherishing that beauty of being kind of part of nature. And I'm curious, what do you think, and I think you've written about this, but what do you think are somehow, or what are the ways that you change your mind today as someone who has so much experience? You still have a certain level of flexibility, and I feel it's what are the ways that you have observed that you're changing your mind, or like switching between different states?
Okay. Well, the general way I change my mind and stay flexible is that I stay talking to people who think differently or see things differently. And then, pretty well by osmosis, I find things changing. In terms of Gestalt therapy, I'm not changing so much now, not because I'm against change, but because what I'm doing works for me and for my clients so well now. And so I would really need to be convinced in practice that something else works better before I would want to change. But I still sort of find myself doing things I haven't done before within that understanding.
And I'm curious, I guess in therapy, the patient is also a teacher as well, and I'm curious basically how much of that has like increased your capacity for empathy in terms of how much unimaginable worlds did you encounter? And actually, you have actively worked in places where people live in worlds which a lot of other people cannot imagine. So yeah, I'm just curious about this.
I love being able to meet people from different cultures and situations and outlooks. And before the pandemic, I was doing lots and lots of traveling, and now I'm doing it online. I'm still teaching in many different countries, but it's different from just being there and participating.
Yeah.
And that really helps me. But there's also a background thing, which is that, if you like, the advantage of being an outsider that existentialists have written about, that the sort of cultural assumptions in Britain were much more visible to me because they were different from the cultural assumptions in my family. So when I went outside my front door, both my language changed from German to English, and the cultural assumptions changed, and I had to learn about that. So I feel like I've been able to be much more neutral in terms of not being tied into one particular culture. Although I've had therapy experiences where my therapist has tried to make me more English, but failed.
Okay. Wow. And I'm also curious, like, is there something that still you are surprised by today, and something that you are almost like having this childlike curiosity about, of something that you have not encountered before?
I've just had one on Monday. I did my first supervision group with trauma counselors in Beirut. And again, an entirely different culture and a very specific and in many ways terrible situation. But meeting and finding a way of being with the people there.
Wow. And I'm curious, since it's almost a war state there still, no?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious basically what is now your experience, because for me, I had a lot of these times thinking, how would it be to be in Auschwitz, or how would it feel like to be in such a dire circumstance? And I'm always thinking of Viktor Frankl and everything he's writing, and I'm actually now very curious. How do you hold space for them, and what are the feelings that are coming up, and where do you see that creativity to soothe them or to soothe the fear they are currently having?
Sure. Well, I mean, for me, the point was more not to be overwhelmed by Auschwitz, because, I mean, my uncle died in Auschwitz.
Mm.
It's not another world. That's not another world for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But one of the things it says, I mean, the people who survived Auschwitz were not the nice people. There was no nice way to survive, and Viktor Frankl was writing about that. So I'm more sort of open to that. Being good is not always the way that people need to find.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that it's how to just live with other people, and how to live with other people who are also racist, for example, or anti-Semitic. It has been much more problem, because when I went to school in London in the 1960s, there was a lot of racism in the school, not just the kids, but also the teachers. And I had some of the bad side of that. How much to fit in with the culture and how much to protest it, and be isolated. All those sort of questions were very actual for me.
And so basically those are the kind of questions or the sources that you are able to then kind of work with the people in Beirut around. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that level of compassion is something that I kind of even miss, because I feel like someone who I recently also have been watching and reading whether someone can, even as a therapist, really relate to a client through a state that the therapist almost cannot imagine or hasn't lived through, or kind of. So I'm just wondering. Actually, yeah, Irvin Yalom was recently kind of talking about this, that now that he has lost his wife, he can look back and sometimes maybe understand the grieving process much better. And and understand some of his clients who would tell him, oh, you know, how can you tell, or how can we relate like this, where you had that stability of your relationship for the last 50 years, for example, and I'm going through a divorce or something. And I understand that there are different levels we can relate, and there can be therapeutic effects. It's just that sometimes I'm curious, what do you think about, this ability to really imagine this very difficult situations where...
I don't think you can imagine it, but I think that isn't the only mechanism involved. I think the stuff that Daniel Stern wrote about so much about mirror neurons, that we can directly intuit what's going on with somebody else in a way which you can't put into words, but you can be there, and how to hold on to yourself and hold on to that is really important. Because, you know, where does that end? All our clients have had different experiences. All our friends have had different experiences. And yet we have to understand each other in a way beyond that. It's philosophically one of the really important things for me about Gestalt therapy, because there's a problem in phenomenology. And that problem is that it can very easily go into your phenomenology and my phenomenology, and I don't know you, I only know my projection of you, which completely contradicts the self-theory of Gestalt therapy, but was very common when I started. I went to my first Gestalt group in 1979. It was very common then. And but if that's true, then what does contact mean? And also, what does love mean? You know, I love my projection onto my wife, while she loves her projection onto me. It all falls apart, but it's difficult to know how to get out of that. But if you have this theory of self, that self and other are co-creating, I know who I am in contrast to the other that I'm now with, then you are part of who I am and I'm part of who you are. So in our contact now, we can know each other. And that gets out of that problem. And I think it might be the only way of getting out of that problem and resurrecting the idea of contact and of love from the more analytic ideas. And that, for me, is one of the most important emotional things behind this theory. And people talking about, you know, you can only talk about my phenomenological field and your phenomenological field, and suddenly we're all individualists again.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually sometimes feel that even that is a paradox we can hold, that part of being individual and having that sense of self, and then still knowing that part of that self is emerging as we are contacting another.
It doesn't mean I know everything about the other person, but I also don't know everything. I can be completely wrong about my own motivations for things as well. It's not about knowing about, it's about there's a place where we can know each other in our contact.
In that sense, the last question I want to ask is basically about I don't know, and that kind of that the flip coin of that is humbleness in a way, and I see using that you using that often. So I am just wondering, where does that ability to use I don't know with such ease come from for you?
Okay. Yes, it's very important for me because we're completely bound by what we know. Unless we have areas of not knowing, then life becomes very dull and predictable. But again, going back to my background, we didn't know what was going to happen next. And as I said, my life changed several times and changed direction several times in ways that I couldn't have predicted, but really like now it's happened. And I absolutely don't know where my clients will end up. And that's another good reason for not being solution focused, because clients find solutions which are well, not solutions but futures which are way beyond anything we could either of us have guessed. A story I tell in training is that when I was in school, one of my traumas was that I was somewhat dyspraxic, and I wasn't chosen for football teams. So there was the choosing for teams, and I was not being chosen. But one of the but what I realize is that none of us in that situation, including me, would have guessed that at this stage I'm a government recognized sports coach and martial arts teacher. It just wouldn't have been in the horizon. And the future one of my clients found was he became a rock star. And neither of us would have imagined that.
Where did he start from before becoming a rock star?
That would be going too far out of confidentiality, but
sorry.
you know, it would have been a surprise to the two of us.
Okay.
And the theory of neurosis in Gestalt therapy is essentially about unaware predictability.
Mm-hmm.
Do the same thing in an unaware way over and over again. And so that means that the task of the therapist is the curious one of facilitating the client to become unpredictable.
Wow.
So if I come in with a knowing of where they should be or what should happen, how can that possibly happen? I'm actually more taking it away from them than supporting that.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't know, there are lots of things I don't know. There are some things I'm really bad at. I've got an awful sense of direction, and I often don't have the slightest idea where I am.
And what are the known unknowns? What are the things that you know you don't know, but you would really love to know at this moment?
Nothing. Well, there are things I know I don't know, but I don't really have a great yearning to know everything.
Yeah. And then just the rapid fire questions. There are 2 or 3 of them. One is, what is an absurd thing about you that you're willing to share, but that not many people know?
I love terrible puns.
Yeah, okay, that is an interesting one. I've got quite a lot of interesting answers to this question, actually. And then
I could give you an example if you like.
Yes, actually, that was my next one.
Yeah. What did the elephant say to the naked man? How do you pick anything up with that?
Yeah, that is a good one. I will get a moment for that to sink in. And then the next one is what has become more and what less important for you with age?
I need to do more to maintain my fitness. Because I know, especially in lockdown, I used to do a lot of exercise with the Aikido, and that's not been available in the same way since the lockdown. Less important. I think people accepting me has become less important because I've got a lot of people who do accept me, and I don't have any particular need for everybody to accept me, which was something that was very strong for me in my young years because I really needed to work to get acceptance.
And if you had a chance to interview someone, live or dead, if you had the possibility, who would that be?
The person who immediately comes to my mind is interviewing Alan Turing after his death. What would you have discovered if you'd stayed alive?
Wow. That's an interesting one. And the last one, is there something you would ask yourself? Something that somehow, you've been interviewed, you've been talking a lot, and then somehow you feel like there is part of you that hasn't been seen, and you wish you had the chance to share that.
I'm sure there are all sorts of things that haven't been seen, but nothing really strikes me that
hasn't been covered.
Well, maybe not just in the words, but in just how we've talked together. I'm good with words, I think, but I give more meaning to what's not verbalized.
You have just heard the story of Peter Philippson, a UK-born Gestalt psychotherapist and trainer doing this work for 33 years. He is fascinated by paradoxes of life, helping human beings to navigate them and find creative solutions to lead a more fulfilled life. You can find more information about Peter on the webpage of the Manchester Gestalt Center given in the podcast notes, and you can find his wonderful books on Amazon and other bookstores. Thank you for joining me for this episode, and I hope you will come along with me on this journey.